The mockery was a dull hum, a fly buzzing against a rain-streaked window pane. Thea heard it, of course. How could she not? The women of the lower quarter market gathered like crows on a wire, their voices sharp and carrying. Look at her, still playing the ghost. One sneered, not bothering to whisper. All that white hair, like an old woman. She's not even 25. Thinks she's too good for the work the rest of us do. Another cackled, her hands deep in a tub of laundry. Too fine to scrub floors or gut fish. Prefers to starve and look pretty. Thea didn't turn. She kept her pale eyes fixed on the cobblestones, her basket clutched tight against her threadbare dress. They weren't entirely wrong. The work they spoke of, the back-breaking, soul-grinding labor that kept a body fed and a roof overhead, required a will to live she simply didn't possess. What was the point of scrubbing a floor when you'd only track more mud across it tomorrow? What was the point of feeding a body that was just an empty, aching shell? Her long, intricate white braids, a legacy of a mother she could barely remember, swung forward, a curtain between her and the world. Each braid was a ritual, a pointless act of preservation in a life that was crumbling to dust. They were a relic from a time when her hands had been steady, her heart full. Now, they were just heavy. Let them talk, she thought, the words a familiar, weary mantra in her mind. Their words are just noise. They can't reach me where I am. Where she was a cold, dark place. A place where the memories lived brighter than the present. The scent of pine and hearth smoke that had clung to her husband, Ronan. The gummy, toothless smile of her son, Liam. The warmth of their small cottage, a sanctuary against the world. All of it, gone. Erased by the border wars, by the fire and steel of a rival pack. They'd taken the strong men to fight and the pretty women for spoils. They'd taken everything else with fire. She was a relic of that fire, her hair bleached white by the shock of her loss, her heart scorched to ash. Her feet carried her past the market, through the stinking alleys where the buildings leaned in so close they blotted out the gray sky. She didn't stop at her ramshackle dwelling. It wasn't a home, just 4 walls and a leaking roof. Instead, she walked towards the edge of the territory, towards the whispering woods that separated their packlands from the wild, untamed mountains. This was her plan. Today was the day. The decision was a cold, smooth stone in her gut. There was no fear, only a vast, yawning relief. She was so tired, tired of the hunger, the cold, the pitying, and the scornful looks, tired of waking up each morning to the fresh hell of remembering they were gone. She had held on for 2 years, a testament to a resilience she never wanted. Now, that resilience was spent. The woods welcomed her with a damp, earthy breath. The air was cooler here, thick with the scent of decaying leaves and pine resin. Sunlight struggled through the dense canopy, casting the forest floor in a shifting, dappled gloom. She moved silently, her steps automatic. She knew this path. She had walked it in her dreams. She was heading for the Blackwater Gorge, a deep, jagged scar in the earth where a river roared violently below. It was a place of stark, brutal beauty, a final, decisive end. Just a little farther, she told herself, her fingers brushing against the rough bark of an ancient oak. Then the noise will stop. The ache will stop. A sudden, sharp sound sliced through her grim resolve. It wasn't an animal. It was a child's cry, choked with terror. Thea froze, her heart giving a single painful lurch against her ribs. No, not now. Don't let this happen now. The cry came again, higher, more desperate. Help! Somebody! Every cell in her body, every dormant, maternal instinct she had buried with her own son, roared to life. It was a physical force, a hook in her soul, yanking her away from the gorge's edge. Her plan, her relief, her exhaustion, all of it vanished, burned away in an instant, by a protectiveness so fierce it stole her breath. She dropped her basket and ran, her worn shoes slipping on the wet leaves. The cries led her off the path, into a thicket of thorny brambles that tore at her dress and skin. She pushed through, ignoring the stinging scratches. She burst into a small clearing and her blood ran cold. A little boy, no more than 3 or 4, was backed against a mossy boulder. Cornering him was a massive, grizzled boar, a lowland brute with tusks like curved daggers. Its small, piggy eyes were fixed on the child, its snout sniffing the air, catching the scent of fear. It pawed the ground, a low, menacing grumble rumbling from its chest. The boy was trembling, his small face streaked with dirt and tears. Thea didn't think. There was no room for thought. "Hey!" she screamed. her voice raw and unfamiliar to her own ears. The boar's head swung towards her. She was a distraction, a new threat. Good. She grabbed a fallen branch, thick and heavy, and charged, swinging it wildly. She wasn't trying to kill the beast, only to enrage it, to draw its attention. The branch connected with its bristly flank with a solid thwack. The boar squealed in outrage, turning its full, furious bulk towards her. "Run!" she yelled at the boy. "Run now!" For a terrifying second, the child didn't move, his wide, stormy gray eyes locked on her. Then, as the boar took a threatening step in her direction, he scrambled to the side, darting behind the boulder. The boar charged. Thea stood her ground for a heartbeat, then dove sideways, rolling as the beast thundered past, its tusk gouging the earth where she had been standing. The smell of it musky, wild, and rank filled her nostrils. She scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. This was a different kind of terror. This was a sharp, vital, fighting terror. It was alive. The boar turned, its sides heaving. It was preparing for another charge. Thea braced herself, the branch feeling flimsy and useless in her hands. This was not the clean end she had chosen. This was messy, and violent, and terrifying. A snarl ripped through the clearing, a sound so deep and primal it vibrated in Thea's bones. It wasn't the boar. From the shadows of the trees, a wolf emerged. No, not a wolf, a shifter. He was enormous, his fur the color of dark honey and smoke, his shoulders level with her chest, his eyes, a blazing, intelligent, stormy gray, fixed on the boar. Power radiated from him in waves, a palpable force that made the air itself feel thick. The boar, sensing a true predator, hesitated. The wolf didn't. He moved with a fluid, deadly grace, a blur of golden fur and muscle. He didn't charge head-on. He feinted, then darted in, his powerful jaws closing around the boar's hind leg with a sickening crunch. The boar screamed, a high-pitched sound of agony, and thrashed wildly. The wolf held on, shaking his massive head, using his weight to drag the larger animal down. Thea could only watch, frozen in a mixture of awe and terror. This was raw, untamed nature, a dance of death far removed from the slow decay she had chosen for herself. The fight was brutal and short. The wolf was a master of his craft, all efficient, lethal movement. With a final, powerful twist of his body, he broke the boar's neck. The beast collapsed, its squeals cutting off abruptly. Silence descended, broken only by the wolf's heavy panting and the frantic pounding of Thea's heart. The wolf released his grip, his muzzle stained dark. He turned those stormy eyes on her, and Thea felt a fresh jolt of fear. He was magnificent and terrifying. This was no simple woodland creature. This was an alpha. His gaze held hers for a long, piercing moment. She saw intelligence there, assessment, and a flicker of something she couldn't name. Then, his form began to shift. It was not a slow, painful transformation, but a swift, seamless blur of light and coalescing matter. The fur receded, the bones cracked and reshaped. And where the great wolf had stood, a man now rose to his full, imposing height. He was breathtaking, wildly, savagely handsome. A tousled, unruly mane of golden blonde hair fell across his brow. His shoulders were impossibly broad, his chest bare and sculpted, gleaming with a light sheen of sweat and a few smears of the boar's blood. He wore only a pair of dark, rugged pants and a dark, open vest that did nothing to hide the powerful, corded muscle of his torso. His eyes, that same intense, stormy gray, scanned her from head to toe, missing no detail: her torn dress, her scratched arms, the intricate white braids that marked her as an outsider, an oddity. He was power incarnate, and Thea felt like a field mouse caught in the shadow of a hawk. Before either of them could speak, the little boy Ian rushed out from behind the boulder. He didn't run to the man. He ran straight to Thea, wrapping his small arms tightly around her legs and burying his face in her skirts. The contact was a lightning strike. It had been so long since a child had touched her. Her own body went rigid, a wave of agonizing memory and unexpected warmth crashing over her. The alpha's eyes narrowed, watching the interaction closely. Ian looked up, his small face tilted back, his eyes, a mirror of his father's, filled with tears and a desperate, trusting relief. He sniffled, his lower lip trembling. Then he spoke a single, impossible word. "Mom." The world stopped. The forest, the dead boar, the formidable alpha, everything faded into a blur. That word, that sacred, broken word, echoed in the silence, hitting a place in Thea's soul so deep and so raw she thought it might kill her after all. Her breath hitched. A single, hot tear escaped, tracing a clean path through the grime on her cheek. Her hand, of its own volition, came up and rested gently on the boy's soft hair. The alpha's gaze snapped from his son's face to hers. The air crackled, thick with unspoken questions, and a tension so sharp it could draw blood. His stormy eyes held hers, no longer just assessing, but searching, probing the very core of her. Who was this frail-looking Omega with the hair of a ghost and the courage to face down a boar? And why had his son, who hated and feared every woman who tried to get close, just called her mother? Thea looked from the vulnerable child clinging to her to the primal, powerful male who was watching her as if she were the most fascinating and dangerous puzzle he had ever encountered. Her path to the gorge was forgotten. Her quietus was denied. She was trapped, caught between a pup who saw a savior and an alpha who saw prey. Or perhaps something else entirely. The word hung in the air between them, a fragile, impossible bridge spanning a chasm of grief and mistrust. Mom. Thea's heart didn't just ache. It shattered. The sound of it on his lips, in a voice so small and trusting, was a physical blow. It was the word she'd ached to hear for 2 long years, the word that belonged to a tiny, cold grave. This child, this stranger's pup, had just handed it back to her, and the weight of it was crushing. Her pale blue eyes, wide with a storm of memory and pain, lifted from the boy's head to meet the alpha's. Asher. His name surfaced in her mind, a piece of common knowledge she'd never had cause to use. The Alpha King. A ruler so powerful, so removed from the grime of the lower quarter, he was practically a myth. And he was staring at her as if she'd just performed a dark and dangerous magic. His stormy gray eyes were narrowed, his powerful body still thrumming with the residual energy of the shift and the kill. He took a step forward, and the air itself seemed to pull taut. Thea instinctively tightened her arm around Ian, a protective gesture that felt as natural as breathing, even as it terrified her. Ian. Asher's voice was a low rumble, deeper than the growl he'd used as a wolf, but no less intimidating. Come here. The boy flinched, burrowing deeper into Thea's skirts. No, he mumbled, his voice muffled by the worn fabric. Mom. Asher's jaw tightened. Thea could see the muscle flexing, a testament to a tightly leashed control. She'd heard the rumors, of course. Whispers in the market about the alpha's motherless pup, a boy so wild and bitter he'd driven away every nursemaid and potential mate with screams and bites. They said the alpha had sworn off women for himself, that his only requirement for a female in his life was one who could pacify his feral son, and this feral son was currently clinging to her, a starving Omega from the slums, as if she were his only anchor in a storm. He's frightened, Thea said, her own voice a hoarse whisper. She cleared her throat, forcing strength into it. The boar. He was cornered. I can see that, Asher replied, his gaze sweeping over her again, this time lingering on the scratches the brambles had left on her arms. The tear in her sleeve, his eyes held no warmth, only a cold, calculating intensity. Who are you? It was the question she'd been dreading. Who was she? A ghost, a widow, a would-be suicide. Nothing. Thea, she answered, because it was the only thing she could give him. Thea, he repeated, and her name sounded foreign and rough in his mouth. What are you doing this deep in the whispering woods? The truth that she had come here to die lodged in her throat. She couldn't say it. Not with this child holding on to her. Not with those fierce gray eyes dissecting her. She looked down at Ian's soft hair, at the way his small shoulders shook with fading sobs. Her motherly instincts, so long buried and neglected, were screaming at her to comfort him, to soothe him. But under the alpha's piercing gaze, she felt frozen. I was walking, she said, the lie weak and transparent. A flicker of something impatience, disbelief crossed Asher's face. He took another step, and now he was close enough that she could smell him. Pine, cold night air, and the rich, metallic scent of blood. It was a primal, overwhelmingly male aroma that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. He was a predator, and she was squarely in his territory. Walking, he echoed, his tone flat. He gestured with his chin towards the branch she dropped. You faced down a lowland boar with a stick. For a pup you don't know. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. He thought she'd planned this. He thought she was one of them, the women who saw his son as a stepping stone, a path to the power and prestige of the Alpha's bed. The realization sent a spike of indignant anger through her numbness. She had been moments from ending her own life. The last thing she coveted was a place in his world. "I heard a child cry for help," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of steel. I didn't stop to ask his pedigree before I acted. Their eyes locked, a silent battle of wills. His were the color of a winter storm, promising violence and cold judgment. Hers were the pale blue of a frozen lake, hiding depths of a pain he couldn't begin to fathom. Ian chose that moment to look up again. His tears had stopped, leaving clean tracks through the dirt on his cheeks. He stared at Thea with an unnerving focus, his little hand reaching up to tentatively touch one of her white braids. "Pretty," he murmured. Thea's breath caught. Asher went utterly still. This was the boy who hated women, the boy who screamed and hid, the boy who had, according to tavern tales, drawn blood, with his tiny teeth on more than one hopeful nursemaid. He wasn't just tolerating Thea's touch, he was seeking it. He was initiating contact. Thea's resolve hardened. She didn't care what the Alpha thought of her. This child was real, and he was scared, and he had called her mom. In the shattered wreckage of her soul, that word had found a piece of her that was still alive. She slowly, carefully, knelt down, bringing herself to Ian's eye level. Ignoring the towering, watchful presence of his father, she focused entirely on the boy. "Are you hurt, little one?" she asked softly, her voice barely a whisper. Ian shook his head, his stormy eyes wide. He was captivated by her hair, by her voice, by the simple, undivided attention she was giving him. It was a language he understood, one he'd been starving for. Motherly love. Not the calculated, simpering affection of women seeking favor, but the genuine, instinctual care of a protector. Thea's fingers, trembling slightly, brushed a leaf from his tunic. "You were very brave." A small, wobbly smile touched his lips. Asher watched the exchange, his expression unreadable. The facts were irrefutable and baffling. This woman, this Thea, with her ghost-pale hair and haunted eyes, had done the impossible. She had not only saved his son a deed for which he owed her a life debt, but she had also achieved in 5 minutes what a parade of the pack's most esteemed females had failed to do in 3 years. She had calmed him. She had earned his trust. His vow echoed in his mind. "I will never love another woman. I just need a woman who can give my son the motherly love he needs." Was this her? This ragged, half-starved creature from the lower quarter? The idea was preposterous, and yet Thea rose to her feet, her legs feeling weak. The adrenaline was fading, leaving her cold and trembling. The grim purpose that had brought her to the woods was gone, replaced by a confusing, terrifying crossroads. She met Asher's gaze again. "He needs to be taken home," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "He's safe now." It was a dismissal. She had done her part. She had interfered with fate's plan for her, and now she needed to retreat, to find her way back to the dark quiet she craved. But Asher's next words stopped her cold. "You're coming with us." It wasn't a request. It was an order, delivered with the absolute authority of a king. Thea stared at him, stunned. "What?" "No. I can't." "You can, and you will," he said, his voice leaving no room for dissent. He gestured to Ian, who was now clinging to Thea's hand. "Look at him. He won't let you go, and I have questions that require answers." His eyes swept over her threadbare dress and hollow cheeks. "You will be compensated for your assistance." The word compensated felt like a slap. He thought she'd done this for a reward. He was treating her like a stray he was bringing in out of the rain, a curious problem to be solved. "I don't want your compensation," she whispered, a flare of her old pride surfacing. "That is not your decision to make," Asher replied, his tone final. He turned, his broad back to her, and began to shift. It was just as swift and awe-inspiring as the first time, the man dissolving back into the massive, golden wolf form. The beast shook itself, then fixed its intelligent, stormy eyes on her, waiting. Ian tugged on her hand, his small face looking up at her with utter faith. "Come, Mom." Thea stood rooted to the spot, trapped between the precipice she had chosen, and the one fate was now thrusting upon her. To go with them was to step back into a world of complication, of power dynamics she didn't understand. Under the scrutiny of a predator who saw her as either a savior or a schemer, it was to open wounds that had only just begun to scar over. But to walk away, to pry this child's trusting hand from her own, and return to the emptiness of the gorge, She found, with a terrifying clarity, that she could not. Taking a deep, shuddering breath that did nothing to calm the frantic beating of her heart, Thea allowed the little boy to lead her forward. She walked toward the waiting Alpha, her every sense screaming in alarm, the ghost of her lost son, a silent, aching presence at her side. She was leaving the wilderness, but she was walking straight into the wolf's den. The journey to the Alpha's lodge was a silent, surreal procession. Thea walked, her hand still encased in Ian's small, trusting one, while the massive golden wolf paced a few feet ahead. Asher moved with a predator's effortless grace, his head constantly swiveling, ears twitching, taking in the forest sounds she couldn't even perceive. He was a shield and a warden all at once. She was painfully aware of her own disheveled state. Her dress was torn and stained with dirt and leaf litter, her arms stinging from a dozen tiny scratches. Her intricate white braids felt heavy, a crown of thorns marking her as an outsider. Every step away from the gorge felt like a betrayal of the peace she had sought, yet every tug from Ian's hand was a tether pulling her back into the land of the living. "What are you doing?" her mind screamed, a frantic, trapped bird. "You were done. You were free. Now you're walking into the lion's den. All because a child called you a name. But it wasn't just a name. It was a key, turning in a lock she'd thought rusted shut. The feel of Ian's hand in hers was a small, warm anchor in the cold sea of her grief. They broke through the tree line, and Thea's breath caught. The Alpha's lodge wasn't a building, it was a part of the mountain itself. Constructed of dark, weathered timber and immense river stone, it sprawled across a high ledge, commanding a view of the entire Pack Valley below. Smoke curled from several chimneys, and the air here was clean, sharp with the scent of pine and cold stone. It was a fortress, a sanctuary of raw, untamed power. It was everything her tiny lost cottage had not been. As they approached a heavy, iron-banded door, Asher shifted back into his human form. The transformation was just as dizzying, the air crackling with spent energy. He didn't look at her, simply pushed the door open and stood aside, his expression an unreadable mask. "Inside," he said, the single word a command. Ian pulled her across the threshold, and Thea stepped into another world. The interior was vast, the ceiling supported by great, carved beams. A massive hearth dominated the main room, a fire crackling within, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow on the fur-strewn floor. The furniture was heavy and simple, built for durability, not delicacy. Trophies of hunts, antlers, and the pelt of a great silver bear adorned the walls. It was masculine, primal, and utterly intimidating, but it was the cleanliness, the sheer solidity of it all, that struck her most. This was a place that knew no hunger, no drafts, no despair. It was a world away from the damp, crumbling shack she called home. The moment the door shut, a hush fell over the two servants who had been tending the fire. Their eyes widened, first at their Alpha's return, then at the sight of the ragged woman and, most astonishingly, the pup who clung to her hand as if it were a lifeline. "Marta," Asher's voice cut through the silence. An older woman with kind eyes and a stern mouth stepped forward. "Draw a hot bath, and find her something suitable to wear." Marta's gaze swept over Thea, taking in the torn dress, the dirt, the startling white hair. There was no judgment in her eyes, only a deep, weary curiosity. "Of course, Alpha." She gestured for Thea to follow. "This way, miss." Ian's grip on Thea's hand tightened. "No," he said, his voice small but firm. "Mom stays." Thea felt a flush of heat creep up her neck. Asher's gaze was a physical weight. "Ian," Thea said softly, kneeling down again. She had to break this connection. It was too dangerous. For both of them. "I am very dirty. I need to get clean. I will see you soon, I promise." His lower lip trembled, those stormy gray eyes filling with a betrayal that felt disproportionately painful. "Promise? I promise," she whispered, the words feeling like a vow she had no right to make. Reluctantly, his fingers uncurled from hers. The loss of contact was like a sudden chill. Marta gave her a reassuring nod and led her away, down a stone-lined corridor away from the main hall. The bath chamber was a luxury Thea had forgotten existed. Steam rose from a sunken tub carved from a single, massive piece of granite. The air smelled of lavender and cedar. Marta busied herself laying out a stack of soft towels and a simple, dark gray woolen dress. "I'll be just outside if you need anything, miss," Marta said, her voice gentle before she withdrew, closing the door with a soft click. Alone, Thea stood frozen for a moment, the opulence of the room feeling like an assault. This was the world of the alpha. This was the world of the man who had everything, while she had nothing. The contrast was a fresh wound. Her fingers fumbled with the ties of her dress, the rough, homespun fabric falling away to pool at her feet. She looked at her body in the steam-hazed air, pale, too thin, the delicate tracery of her ribs visible beneath her skin. The freckles across her nose and shoulders stood out like scattered dust. She was a wisp, a ghost, utterly out of place in this temple of strength and solidity. She stepped into the water, and a gasp escaped her as the heat enveloped her. It was almost painfully wonderful, seeping into her cold bones, loosening muscles she hadn't realized were clenched. She sank until the water lapped at her chin, closing her eyes. For the first time in years, a sensation other than numbness or agony registered. Simple, physical comfort, but her mind would not quiet. Images flashed behind her eyelids. Ronan's laughing face, Liam's chubby hands, the boar's beady eyes, Asher's intense, stormy gaze, and Ian's voice, echoing, "Mom." A single, hot tear escaped and traced a path down her temple, mingling with the bathwater. What was happening to her? She had built a fortress of grief around herself, and a little boy had simply walked through the walls as if they weren't there. She didn't know how long she stayed there, hiding in the steam, but a soft knock at the door eventually roused her. "Miss," it was Marta. "The Alpha requests your presence in the Great Hall." The moment of peace was over. Thea rose from the water, her skin flushed pink. She dried herself with the impossibly soft towels and pulled on the gray dress. It was simple, but the wool was fine and warm, and it hung on her slender frame, making her look even more fragile. She rebraided her white hair with trembling fingers, the familiar ritual doing little to calm the frantic beating of her heart. Marta led her back to the main hall. The fire was blazing higher now, and Asher was waiting for her. He had changed into a clean, dark tunic and pants, his golden hair still damp. He stood before the hearth, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, his presence dominating the vast space. Ian was nowhere to be seen. "Sit," he said, not turning around. Thea moved to a heavy wooden chair near the fire, perching on the edge of it, her back straight. She felt like a rabbit caught in an open field. Finally, he turned. His stormy eyes raked over her, from her freshly braided hair to the too large dress. The clean, simple garment seemed to highlight her poverty rather than conceal it. He took a slow sip from his glass, his gaze never leaving her face. "Now," he began, his voice deceptively calm, "we will have the truth. What were you really doing in the woods today, Thea?" This was it. The interrogation. She could lie, concoct a story about foraging, but looking into those hard, perceptive eyes, she knew a lie would be instantly dismantled. He was a predator, and he could smell fear, and he could surely smell deceit. She took a shallow breath, her eyes dropping to the flames in the hearth. The truth was all she had left. It was ugly and shameful, but it was hers. "I went to the gorge to—" Her voice broke. She forced the words out, each one a shard of glass in her throat. "To jump." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the crackle of the fire. She dared a glance up at him. His expression had not changed, but the intensity in his eyes had sharpened, focused. He was studying her with a new, unsettling depth. He hadn't expected that. "Why?" The question was blunt, devoid of pity. A bitter, broken sound that was almost a laugh escaped her. "Why does anyone seek that end? The pain, it becomes too heavy to carry." "What pain?" She looked at him then, truly looked at him. This powerful alpha, this king who had never wanted for anything, who had never known true loss. Could he even understand? "I had a family," she said, her voice a hollow whisper. "A husband, a son. They were taken from me. In the border wars, 2 years ago." She saw a flicker of something, not sympathy, but recognition in his eyes. He knew of that conflict, the one that had stolen so many. "There was nothing left for me after that, just an emptiness. Today, I decided I was done filling it." She had laid herself bare before him, offering up the shattered pieces of her soul. She expected dismissal, scorn, perhaps even a cold order to leave. Asher was silent for a long time, his stormy gaze locked on her. He swirled the liquid in his glass, his thoughts hidden behind an impenetrable mask. He had asked for the truth, and she had given it to him in its most brutal form. Finally, he set his glass down on the mantelpiece with a definitive click. The sound echoed in the quiet hall. Ian's mother died giving birth to him, he said, his voice low and gravelly. The statement was so unexpected it took Thea a moment to process it. He has never known a mother's touch. The women who have tried, they saw a path to me. He sensed their falseness. He hates them for it. He took a step toward her, and Thea instinctively shrank back into the chair. He loomed over her, his presence overwhelming. But he does not hate you, Asher continued, his eyes boring into hers. He called you mother. He trusts you. And I made a vow that my son would have the care he needs. Thea's heart hammered against her ribs. She saw where this was going, and it terrified her. You will stay, Asher declared, his tone leaving no room for argument. It was not a request. It was a decree. You will be his nursemaid. You will see to his needs, comfort his fears. You will give him the motherly love he is owed. You can't be serious, Thea breathed, her mind reeling. I'm no one. I'm broken. Your brokenness is what he responds to, Asher countered, his voice stark. You have no agenda. You carry a pain he understands on an instinctual level. You are not trying to use him. You are the first real thing he has found in a woman since his mother died. He leaned down, bracing his hands on the arms of her chair, caging her in. The scent of him pine and alpha and sheer, untamed power enveloped her. Her pulse skyrocketed, a frantic, prey-like rhythm. This is not a negotiation, Thea, he said, his voice a low, primal rumble that vibrated through her very bones. You saved my son's life. In return, you will give him a reason to live. And in doing so, you will find a reason for your own. He straightened, looking down at her as if she were a new, complex strategy on a battlefield. You wanted an end to your suffering? You will not find it here. Your old life is over. As of this moment, you belong to Ian. He turned and walked away, leaving her sitting by the fire, her body trembling, her mind a whirlwind of shock and dread. She had escaped the gorge only to be captured. She had traded one kind of end for another, a gilded cage, a purpose she never wanted, and the terrifying, watchful eye of a predator who saw her not as a woman, but as a tool for his son's happiness. She was trapped. The silence Asher left in his wake was heavier than any Thea had ever known. It was thick with the echo of his decree. You belong to Ian. The words were not a comfort. They were chains, forged from grief and a child's desperate need. She sat frozen in the chair, the warmth of the fire doing nothing to melt the ice forming in her veins. Marta reappeared, her footsteps soft on the fur rugs. Her kind eyes took in Thea's pallor, the tremor in her hands resting on her knees. Come, miss, she said, her voice gentle but firm. I'll show you to your room. It's adjacent to the little master's. Thea rose on unsteady legs, allowing herself to be led from the great hall. They moved down a different corridor, this one quieter. The stone walls hung with simple tapestries depicting wolves under starlit skies. Marta stopped before a heavy oak door and pushed it open. The room was small, but to Thea, it seemed palatial. A bed with a real mattress and thick wool blankets stood against one wall. A simple washstand and a chest of drawers occupied another. A single, narrow window looked out over the darkening forest. It was clean, warm, and safe. It was everything her shack wasn't. The sheer normality of it was somehow more disorienting than the opulence of the bath chamber. This is for me? Thea whispered, her fingers brushing the rough, clean wool of the blanket. For you, Marta confirmed. She gestured to a connecting door, left slightly ajar. And that leads to Ian's chamber. He often has bad dreams. The Alpha thought it best you be close. The Alpha thought. Of course he did. He was orchestrating every move, placing his pieces on the board. Thea was the new, unexpected piece meant to calm his restless air. Thank you, Marta, Thea said, her voice hollow. The older woman gave her a long, appraising look. He's a good boy, she said softly. His heart is just locked away. It seems you might have the key. With that, she slipped out, closing the door behind her. Alone again, Thea sank onto the edge of the bed. The springs creaked, a foreign sound. She stared at the connecting door. Beyond it was the child who had upended her death, and now owned her life. The weight of it was suffocating. Her gaze drifted to the window. The sky was a deep, bruised purple, the first stars pricking through the twilight. Out there, beyond the ridge, was the Blackwater Gorge. Her freedom, her peace. It felt 1,000 miles away. A soft, muffled sob from the next room snapped her from her thoughts. It was Ian. Her body moved before her mind could form a protest. She was at the connecting door in 2 strides, pushing it open. Ian's room was larger, filled with carved wooden toys and a small, neatly made bed. He was curled in a tight ball in the center of it, his small shoulders shaking. The sight was a physical ache in her chest, a mirror of her own endless nights of silent weeping. "Ian," she said softly, stepping into the room. He flinched, lifting a tear-streaked face. In the dim light from her room, his stormy gray eyes were wide pools of fear. "The monster," he choked out. "The one with the tusks. The boar." The memory was haunting his dreams. Thea's resolve, so fragile moments before, solidified. This was not about Asher's commands or her own trapped feeling. This was about a terrified child. She crossed the room and sat on the edge of his bed, careful not to crowd him. "The monster is gone," she said, her voice low and steady. "Your father made sure of that. He was very brave." "He was big," Ian whispered, his eyes fixed on her. "Yes, he was. But he's gone now. You are safe here, in your strong house." She reached out slowly, giving him every chance to pull away, and laid her hand gently on his back. Through the soft fabric of his nightshirt, she could feel the frantic beat of his heart. He didn't pull away. Instead, he shuddered, and a fresh wave of tears came. "Don't go," he pleaded, his voice small and broken. The words were a key turning in the rusted lock of her heart. "Don't go." How many times had she screamed those same words into a silent, unheeding universe? "I'm right next door," she soothed, rubbing slow circles on his back. "I promised I would see you soon. Remember? And I keep my promises." He shook his head, his little body trembling. "No. Stay. Please." Thea hesitated. This was a line. To stay, to comfort him through the night, was to sink deeper into the role Asher had forced upon her. It was to weave herself into the fabric of this child's life, a fabric she knew she would eventually have to tear herself away from. The pain of that future separation already loomed, a fresh ghost beside the old ones. But looking at his tear-stained face, feeling the trust radiating from his small form, she found she had no choice. "All right," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "Scoot over." He moved immediately, making room for her. Thea lay down on top of the covers, on her side, facing him. She was still wearing the gray dress, feeling awkward and out of place in this child's bed. Ian immediately curled into her, his head finding a place against her shoulder, his small fist clutching a fold of her dress. His breathing began to slow, the hiccuping sobs subsiding. Thea lay rigid at first, the warmth of his small body seeping into hers. It was an agony and a balm all at once. It was a feeling she had sworn she would never feel again, a precious, terrible weight. She began to hum, a tuneless, forgotten lullaby from a lifetime ago, a song she had sung to Liam. The notes felt strange in her throat, like a language she'd almost forgotten. Slowly, Ian's breathing evened out into the deep, regular rhythm of sleep. His grip on her dress loosened. Thea, however, remained awake. She stared into the darkness of the room, listening to the sound of his breath and the distant crackle of the hearth in the great hall. Her mind was a whirlwind. She was a prisoner here, but her cell was a warm room next to a sleeping child. Her jailer was a formidable alpha who saw her as a tool, but the tool was her own shattered capacity to love. It was then that a shadow fell across the sliver of light from the corridor. Thea's breath hitched. She didn't need to turn her head to know who stood in the doorway. Asher. She could feel his presence, a shift in the air, a primal awareness that made the fine hairs on her nape stand up. He didn't speak, didn't enter. He simply watched. How long had he been there? Had he heard her humming? Had he seen the way his son was curled against her, finally at peace? She kept her eyes closed, feigning sleep, her entire body tensed. She felt like a doe frozen in a clearing, knowing a wolf was watching from the tree line. The predator-prey dynamic was a live wire between them. Even here, in this quiet nursery, after what felt like an eternity, the shadow moved. She heard the soft sound of the main door to Ian's room closing, but not the click of the latch. He had left it open. A small gesture, but one laden with meaning. He was acknowledging her presence, sanctioning it, but not fully trusting it. He was still watching. When she was sure he was gone, Thea opened her eyes. The room was dark again, save for the sliver of moonlight through the window. Ian slept on, undisturbed. A single hot tear escaped from the corner of her eye and traced a path into her white hair. She was trapped in a gilded cage, yes, but as she lay there, with a child's warm weight nestled against her, she realized the bars of that cage were not made of stone or command. They were being forged, link by terrifying link, from the feel of a small, trusting hand in hers, and the silent, watchful presence of a king who saw not just a tool, but a mystery he was determined to solve. The emptiness inside her was still there, a vast and aching chasm, but for the first time in 2 long years, something else was there too, small and fragile and terrifying. A reason to see the dawn. Thea woke to the feeling of small, curious fingers tracing the lines of her face. For one blissful, disoriented moment, the scent of pine and warm child, the softness of a real bed, tricked her into believing the past 2 years were a nightmare. Then her eyes fluttered open to the sight of Ian's stormy gray gaze, inches from her own, and the memories crashed back in a suffocating wave. She was in the Alpha's lodge. She was a prisoner of a child's need. "You have lines here," Ian whispered, his fingertip gently touching the faint, weary lines at the corner of her eye. Thea's breath caught. It was an observation devoid of judgment, full of a child's innocent curiosity. "Those are from remembering," she said, her voice rough with sleep. He considered this, his brow furrowing in a way that was so like his father it was unnerving. "Do they hurt?" "Every day." "No, little one, they don't hurt." Satisfied, he scrambled off the bed, his nightmare seemingly forgotten in the clear light of morning. "I'm hungry." Thea sat up, her body stiff from a night spent lying rigidly on top of the covers. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the air. The normalcy of the scene was jarring. Marta entered a moment later, carrying a tray laden with food, a pot of steaming porridge, a slab of honey, fresh bread, and dried berries. Thea's stomach clenched, both with hunger and a sharp sense of unworthiness. "The Alpha has asked that you join him on the training grounds after you've broken your fast," Marta said, her tone neutral as she set the tray on a small table. The porridge tasted like ash in Thea's mouth. The training grounds. Of course. He wanted to see his new acquisition in the light of day, to assess her in front of his pack, to show them the strange, white-haired creature his son had imprinted upon. After breakfast, Marta led her not back to the great hall, but through a rear archway that opened onto a broad, flat expanse of hard-packed earth nestled against the mountain. The air here was filled with the sounds of grunting men, the clatter of wooden practice swords, and the sharp, guttural commands of the training masters. Dozens of warriors, shirtless and gleaming with sweat, were sparring, running drills, and lifting heavy stones. It was a display of raw, potent masculinity that made Thea feel even more insubstantial, a pale moth drawn into a den of wolves. Her delicate features and intricate white braids drew immediate attention. The rhythmic clashing of practice weapons faltered, conversations died, every eye turned to her. She felt their gazes like physical touches, curious, suspicious, disdainful. She was an anomaly, a ghost walking in the sun. She kept her head high, her pale blue eyes fixed on a point in the distance, the way she had in the lower quarter market. Let them look, she thought, but the old mantra felt feeble here. This was not the dismissive scorn of bitter women. This was the assessing, predatory interest of warriors. And then she saw him. Asher stood at the center of it all. He wasn't sparring, but observing, his arms crossed over his bare, powerfully sculpted chest. He wore only a pair of dark, soft leather pants, and the morning sun gilded his skin, highlighting the play of muscle across his shoulders and abdomen. He was the epicenter of the power in the clearing, a king surveying his army. His stormy gaze found hers instantly, pinning her in place from across the field. Marta melted away, leaving Thea standing alone at the edge of the packed earth. There was no retreat. Taking a shallow breath, she began to walk towards him, feeling the weight of 100 stairs. The distance to where he stood felt like a mile. As she drew closer, she saw the faint scars that mapped his torso, a pale line across his ribs, another on his shoulder. Testaments to a life of violence and survival. His tousled golden hair was pushed back from his face, his expression unreadable. He didn't greet her. He simply watched her approach, his eyes doing that same thorough, discomfiting inventory they had the day before. He was comparing the ragged woman from the woods to the one now cleansed and clad in his pack's wool, and Thea had no idea which version he found more acceptable. "Ian slept through the night," he stated. It wasn't a question. "He did," Thea replied, her voice barely audible over the training noises. "He says you sang to him." Thea's cheeks warmed. "I hummed." "It was nothing." "It was not nothing," Asher countered, his voice low, for her ears only. "He has not slept through the night without a potion, or one of my guards being forced to hold him down through his night terrors since he was an infant." He took a step closer, and Thea had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. The sheer size of him was overwhelming. "What did you hum?" The question was so unexpected, so intimate, it threw her. An old lullaby. My mother used to sing it. It was a piece of her past she had no wish to share with him. His intense gaze searched her face, as if trying to decipher the secrets behind her pale eyes. It worked. He turned his head slightly, his voice rising to a command that carried across the field. "Kale!" A massive warrior with a brutal scar across his cheek broke from a sparring match and jogged over, his eyes flickering to Thea with open curiosity before fixing on his alpha. "Alpha, Thea, this is Kale, my head of security and training master," Asher said, his tone now all business. "Kale, Thea will be staying with us as Ian's caretaker. I want you to teach her basic self-defense. Knife work. How to break a hold." Thea stared at him, stunned. "What? Why?" Asher's eyes met hers, and they were hard as flint. "Because you faced a boar with a stick. Because you are now responsible for the most valuable member of this pack next to myself. And because I will not have the person my son depends on be helpless." He leaned in, his voice dropping again, a low, predatory rumble. "The woods are not the only place with dangers, little Omega. You will learn to protect what is yours." What is yours? The words were a brand. He was making it official, binding her to his son not just with words, but with action. Kale grunted, looking her up and down with a skeptical eye. "She's a wisp, Alpha. She'll break." "Then don't break her," Asher said flatly, his gaze still locked on Thea. "Start today." With a final, unreadable look, he turned and walked away, leaving her with the hulking warrior. Kale crossed his thick arms. "Ever held a knife, girl?" Thea's mind was reeling. This was not what she had expected. She had anticipated being relegated to a nursery, kept out of sight. Instead, Asher was putting her on display and forcing her to learn the pack's violent ways. It was another layer of his control, another way to reshape her into what he needed her to be. "No," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and a spark of defiance. Right then, Kale pulled a practice dagger, its blade blunted but its weight real, from his belt and shoved it into her hand. The hilt was cold and heavy, alien in her grasp. First lesson: how to grip it so you don't drop it on your own foot. For the next hour, Thea was put through a grueling, humiliating tutorial. Kale was a brusque, impatient teacher. He corrected her stance with a rough shove, barked at her when her grip was wrong, and scoffed when her first, feeble thrust with the practice dagger had no power behind it. "Put your body into it. You're not swatting a fly," he growled. Thea's arms ached. Her pride was in tatters. The warriors who had initially been curious now watched her fumbling attempts with barely concealed amusement. She was a spectacle, the fragile Omega trying to play at being a warrior. But beneath the humiliation, a stubborn ember began to glow. Asher thought she was helpless. The pack saw her as weak, but she had faced down a boar. She had survived the unsurvivable. She was still here. Her fingers tightened around the hilt of the practice dagger. When Kale moved to adjust her stance again, she didn't flinch. She planted her feet, channeling all her frustration, her fear, her buried rage into the movement. She didn't just thrust the dagger. She lunged, putting the full, desperate weight of her body behind it. The movement was still clumsy, but it had force. It had intention. Kale's eyebrows rose a fraction. Better. From the raised platform where he observed the training, Asher watched the entire exchange. He saw the initial humiliation, the trembling in her hands, and he saw the moment it changed. He saw the subtle straightening of her spine, the fierce set of her jaw, the flash of something fiery and resilient in her pale blue eyes. It was the same spirit that had made her stand between a boar and a child. A slow, thoughtful frown touched his lips. She was not just broken. She was a shattered vase, and the pieces were sharp. He had brought her here for his son, but as he watched Thea, breathless and sweating, grip the knife as if it were a lifeline, he realized the prey he had captured had thorns, and the predator in him was deeply, dangerously intrigued. Thea's lungs burned, and a fine tremor had taken up permanent residence in her arms. The blunted practice dagger felt like it was made of lead, but her grip was firm, her knuckles white. Kale's grunt of "better" was a hard-won prize, and a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years, a spark of pure, unadulterated accomplishment, warmed her chest. It was small, a single ember in the vast cold of her grief, but it was there. From his platform, Asher watched that tiny spark catch. He He saw the way she held herself differently after that successful lunge, not just enduring the lesson, but absorbing it. The set of her shoulders was no longer purely defensive. There was a new, nascent strength there. The prey was learning to bare its teeth. The thought sent a primal, unexpected thrill through him. He dismissed Kale with a curt nod. The training master gave Thea a final, appraising look. "We're done. Don't get yourself killed before our next lesson." He strode away, bellowing at a pair of young warriors who had been slacking off. Thea stood alone, chest heaving, the sounds of the training ground crashing over her once more. She became acutely aware of the lingering stares, some now tinged with a grudging respect instead of outright mockery. She had passed some unspoken first test. "Thea." Asher's voice, close behind her, made her jump. She turned to find him there, having moved from his platform with a predator's silent grace. He was so close she could see the individual golden stubble dusting his jaw, smell the clean sweat and sun-warmed skin. "Walk with me," he said, not a request, but not the harsh command of before. It was the tone of a king who expected to be obeyed, yet held a flicker of curiosity. He didn't wait for her agreement, turning and striding towards a path that led away from the training grounds, winding up towards a higher ridge. Her body protested, every muscle screaming, but she fell into step beside him, her shorter legs forcing her to take 2 steps for every one of his. They walked in silence for a few minutes, the sounds of the pack fading behind them, replaced by the whisper of the wind through the pines and the call of a distant hawk. The path opened onto a small, secluded overlook. Below, the entire Pack Valley sprawled out the lodges and smokehouses of the main settlement, the winding silver ribbon of a river, the patchwork of fields. It was a view of a thriving, powerful world, a world she had only ever seen from the bottom looking up. "This was my mother's favorite place," Asher said, his voice quieter now, almost pensive. He stood with his hands on his hips, his broad back to her as he surveyed his kingdom. Thea said nothing, unsure why he was sharing this with her. She watched the way the wind tugged at his unruly golden hair, the way the sunlight carved the muscles of his back into stark relief. He was a part of this landscape, as wild and untamed as the mountains themselves. "Ian asked for you this morning," he continued, still not looking at her, before he even asked for food. "He wanted to show you his favorite wooden wolf." The statement was a simple one, but it landed with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just a need for comfort in the dark, it was a desire for her presence in the light. He wanted to share his world with her. The ember in her chest glowed a little brighter, and with it came a fresh, sharp ache. She was letting him in. She was betraying the memory of her own son by caring for this one. "He's a sweet boy," Thea managed, her voice tight. Finally, Asher turned. His stormy eyes were less intense here, shaded with a contemplation she hadn't seen before. "He is. But he is also stubborn and sharp, and he feels things too deeply. Traits he gets from his mother." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her face, lingering on the faint freckles across her nose. "And you? What traits did your son inherit from you?" The question was like a knife slipped between her ribs. She flinched, her pale eyes flooding with instant, raw pain. She looked away, towards the vastness of the valley, anything to escape his probing gaze. She had never spoken of Liam to anyone. His name was a sacred, shattered relic she kept locked away. He had my smile," she whispered, the words torn from a place deep inside she'd thought sealed forever. Or so Ronan always said. "And my stubbornness." He would dig his heels in when he didn't want to eat his porridge. A choked sound, half laugh, half sob, escaped her. A tear, hot and unwelcome, traced a path down her cheek. She wiped it away angrily. She expected him to press, or to dismiss her pain as a weakness. Instead, Asher was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. "Grief is not a line to be crossed," he said. "It is a territory to be inhabited. The borders shift. Some days, the landscape is barren. Other days," he gestured vaguely towards the lush valley below. "Other days, you find a patch of sun." Thea stared at him, stunned. This was not the ruthless alpha issuing commands. This was a man who understood loss. She remembered then that Ian's mother had died. He, too, inhabited that desolate territory. The realization created a fragile, unexpected bridge between them. Before she could form a response, a voice, sweet as poisoned honey, cut through the air. "Asher, there you are. I've been looking all over for you." A woman emerged onto the overlook. She was stunning, with waves of dark hair, eyes the color of rich earth, and a curvaceous body clad in soft, finely tanned leather. She moved with a confident, sensual grace that made Thea feel instantly like a clumsy, pale shadow. This was Lyra, the pack's head huntress. Thea had heard her name whispered with a mix of respect and fear in the lower quarter. Lyra had made no secret of her ambition to become the next alpha's mate. Lyra's smile was brilliant and entirely for Asher, but her dark eyes flicked to Thea, and in that instant, Thea saw the cold calculation, the sharp-edged jealousy. The smile didn't reach them. "Kale said you were up here." Lyra purred, slipping her arm through Asher's with a familiarity that spoke of long-standing acquaintance. "I wanted to discuss the patrol schedules for the Northern Pass." Her eyes slid back to Thea, sweeping over her practice-weary form and simple gray dress. "And who is this? The new servant?" Asher's posture shifted subtly. The contemplative man vanished, replaced once more by the alpha. He didn't shake off Lyra's touch, but his tone was neutral. "Lyra, this is Thea. She is Ian's new caretaker." "Is she?" Lyra's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose. "How unconventional. I didn't realize we were recruiting from the lower quarter for such a sensitive position." Her gaze landed on Thea's white braids. "Though I suppose her appearance is certainly memorable. The pup must find her fascinating." The words were a masterclass in venom, each one coated in a thin layer of polite concern. Thea felt her face grow warm, the fragile connection she'd felt with Asher shattering under Lyra's disdain. She was an outsider, a novelty, a dirty secret brought up from the slums. "Thea saved Ian's life yesterday," Asher stated, his voice gaining an edge. "She has his trust. That is what matters." "Of course," Lyra said smoothly, though her eyes promised a different conversation. "How fortunate for us all." She tightened her grip on Asher's arm. "Now, about those patrols, Alpha. It's rather urgent." Asher gave Thea a final, unreadable look. "Return to the lodge. Ian will be waiting for his lunch." "Dismissed." Thea nodded mutely, turning away from the overlook, from the breathtaking view and the even more breathtaking tension between the alpha and the huntress. As she walked back down the path, the ember of accomplishment from her training was doused by the cold water of Lyra's hostility. But as she entered the lodge, a small, powerful force slammed into her legs. "Mom, you're back!" Ian looked up at her, his stormy eyes bright, a beautifully carved wooden wolf clutched in his hand. "Look, this is Fen. He's the bravest wolf in the whole forest. I wanted to show you." He was waiting for her. He had something to share with her. Thea's heart, so recently bruised and uncertain, squeezed so tightly she thought it might stop. She knelt, ignoring the protest of her tired muscles, and took the proffered toy. "He's very brave," she said, her voice thick. "Just like you." Ian beamed, a sunburst of pure, uncomplicated joy. He grabbed her hand, his small, warm one engulfing her fingers. "Come on, Marta made honey cakes." He pulled her towards the kitchen, chattering about Fen's adventures. Thea let herself be led, the ghost of Lyra's sneer fading in the radiant light of Ian's smile. The territory of her grief was still vast and barren, but here, in this warm lodge, with this child's hand in hers, she had indeed found a patch of sun. It was small and fragile and surrounded by thorns, but for the first time, she didn't pull away from its warmth. She leaned into it, and for a moment, the ache inside her didn't feel quite so endless. The kitchen was a haven of warmth and tantalizing smells. Marta was pulling a tray of golden honey cakes from the hearth, their sweet, caramelized scent filling the air and making Thea's empty stomach clench with a sharp, sudden hunger. Ian released her hand and scrambled onto a stool, his eyes fixed on the pastries with rapt attention. "One for you, little master," Marta said, her stern mouth softening as she placed a steaming cake on a wooden plate before him. "And one for you, miss," she added, sliding a second plate towards Thea. Thea stared at the cake. It was a simple thing, really, but it was offered without pity, without any expectation. It was just food, a kindness. After the grueling training and Lyra's cutting remarks, it felt like a peace offering from the universe itself. "Thank you, Marta," Thea said, her voice husky. Ian was already devouring his cake with the single-minded focus of a puppy, getting sticky honey all over his fingers and chin. Thea picked hers up. It was almost too hot to touch. She broke off a small piece and brought it to her lips. The flavor exploded on her tongue, sweet, rich, with a faint hint of spice. It was the most delicious thing she had tasted in years. A small, involuntary sound of pleasure escaped her. Ian giggled, a sticky, joyful sound. They're good, right? They're wonderful, Thea agreed, and she meant it. For a few minutes, there was no grief, no alpha, no jealous huntress. There was only the simple, profound pleasure of warm food and a child's company. When they were done, Ian slid off his stool, his energy seemingly boundless. "Come see my fort," he demanded, grabbing her sticky hand again. He led her back to his room, where he had constructed a haphazard fortress from blankets draped over chairs and his bed. It was a cozy, lopsided cave. He crawled inside, then peeked out, his expression serious. "You have to ask for the secret password to enter the wolf's den." Thea felt a genuine smile, small and unused, touch her lips. "What is the password?" "Honey cake," he whispered loudly. "Honey cake," Thea repeated solemnly, and crawled into the fort after him. The space was dim and close, smelling of clean linen and little boy. Ian had dragged a few of his favorite toys inside, Fen the wooden wolf, a stuffed bear missing an eye, and a smooth, colorful river stone. He arranged them with great ceremony. "This is the pack," he explained, pointing to the toys. "Fen is the alpha, bear is the... well, he's the bear, and the stone is the treasure we have to protect from the bad thing." His face clouded for a moment, the memory of the boar surfacing. Thea's heart ached for him. He was reenacting his trauma, trying to master it in the safety of his blanket den. She understood the impulse all too well. "What does the pack need to do to protect the treasure?" she asked softly, settling herself on the fur rug. Ian's brow furrowed in concentration. "They have to be brave, and they have to stick together. The alpha has to be the strongest." He picked up the wooden wolf. "My papa is the strongest alpha in the whole world." "I believe he is," Thea said, and she found she meant that too. She had seen the proof on the training grounds. "He said you were brave," Ian said, his stormy eyes fixing on her with that unnerving directness. "He told me at breakfast. He said you stood in front of the monster for me." Thea's breath hitched. Asher had said that? To Ian? He had framed her not as a helpless Omega, but as a brave protector. The ember in her chest glowed warmer. "Anyone would have," she murmured. Ian shook his head, his expression turning dark. "No, the other ladies wouldn't. They just smell funny and try to pinch my cheeks. They're scared of everything, even of my papa." He scooted closer to her, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But you're not scared of him, are you?" The question startled a laugh out of her, a rusty, unfamiliar sound. "I am a little scared of him," she admitted. It felt strangely liberating to say it aloud. Ian considered this. "That's okay. He's really big. But he won't hurt you. You're my mom." He said it with such finality, as if he had decreed it, and that was the end of the matter. The title no longer felt like a shard of glass. It felt different, softer. A title he had bestowed, not one she had stolen. He curled up next to her, laying his head in her lap with a trust that was as terrifying as it was beautiful. His eyelids began to droop, the excitement of the morning finally catching up with him. Thea sat in the quiet dimness of the blanket fort, her fingers gently stroking his soft hair. The rhythmic motion was as soothing to her as it was to him. This was healing. It wasn't a grand gesture or a sudden epiphany. It was this, the weight of a child's head in her lap, the smell of honey and boy, the simple act of keeping watch while he slept. She was not replacing Liam. She was, for the first time, allowing a new, different kind of love to exist beside the old, eternal one. The two could coexist. The realization was a gentle rain on parched earth. She didn't know how long they stayed like that. She was drifting in a peaceful, thoughtless haze when the blanket at the entrance to the fort was pulled aside. Asher stood there, silhouetted against the light of the room. He had cleaned up, wearing a fresh, dark tunic. His gaze took in the scene. The lopsided fort, the scattered toys, his son sleeping peacefully with his head in Thea's lap, her pale hand resting on his hair. Thea froze, expecting a reprimand, a cold comment about coddling the future alpha, but Asher didn't speak. He simply watched. The intense, assessing look was still there, but the storm in his eyes had stilled into something quieter, more profound. He looked from Ian's utterly relaxed face to Thea's. She knew she must look a mess. Her braids were coming loose from the training, her simple dress was rumpled from the fort, and her eyes were likely still red-rimmed from her earlier tears on the overlook. Yet, he didn't look away. He slowly knelt down, the movement fluid and silent, so as not to wake the boy. The space inside the blanket fort suddenly felt infinitely smaller, filled with his powerful presence. The scent of him, clean skin and crisp mountain air wrapped around her, mingling with the scent of honey and child. His eyes, that captivating stormy gray, held hers. He didn't smile, but the harsh lines of his face had softened ever so slightly. He fought his nap for 3 hours yesterday, Asher murmured, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the quiet space. Screamed until he was hoarse. Thea's throat was tight. She could only look back at him, her fingers still absently stroking Ian's hair. You, Asher began, then seemed to search for the right word. His gaze dropped to her hand on his son's head, then back to her face. You have a quiet magic about you, Thea. It wasn't praise. It was an observation, a statement of fact. And it held more weight than any flattery ever could. Before she could process it, before she could even think of a response, he reached out, not for her, but to gently brush a stray lock of hair from Ian's forehead. His knuckles, calloused and scarred, grazed the fine wool of her dress just above her knee. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt like lightning through her. It was the first time he had touched her since the woods. Her skin tingled, and her breath caught in her throat. The predator was close, but the threat was gone, replaced by a tension that was entirely different, more confusing, and infinitely more dangerous. His eyes met hers again, and they were dark, unreadable pools. The air in the blanket fort crackled. Then, with the same silent grace, he rose to his feet and backed away, letting the blanket fall back into place, leaving her alone in the dim, warm den with the sleeping child. Thea sat perfectly still, her heart hammering against her ribs. The ghost of his touch burned on her leg. The memory of his words echoed in her mind. You have a quiet magic. The territory of her grief was still there, but the patch of sun had grown larger, warmed not just by a child's love, but by the first, tentative, and terrifying ray of a king's regard. And outside the fragile walls of her blanket fort, she knew the thorns in the form of a beautiful, jealous huntress were waiting. The piece of the blanket fort was a fragile bubble, and it popped the moment Thea emerged. Ian was still sleeping soundly, and she had carefully extricated herself. Her body stiff but her spirit strangely light. That lightness evaporated as soon as she stepped into the main hall. Lyra was there, waiting. She leaned against the massive hearth, her posture a study in casual dominance. She wasn't alone. 2 other women, both dressed in the fine, practical leathers of high-ranking pack females, flanked her. Their eyes, sharp and assessing, tracked Thea's every move. So, Lyra began, her voice a silken purr that didn't hide the steel beneath. The ghost has decided to join the living. Thea stopped, her hands clenching unconsciously at her sides. She said nothing, employing the same silent endurance she'd used in the market. But this felt different. This was a direct challenge. We were just discussing the upcoming moon gathering, Lyra continued, pushing off the hearth and taking a slow, deliberate step forward. Her dark eyes swept over Thea's rumpled dress and loose braids. It's a very important tradition for the pack, a time for strengthening bonds, for honoring our warriors, for the alpha to consider his future. Her gaze was a pointed weapon. I suppose you wouldn't know anything about our traditions, being from elsewhere. One of the other women, a blonde with a hawk-like nose, sniffed. It's hardly a place for a lower quarter Omega, especially one who's meant to be watching the pup. The words were meant to wound, to isolate. They were drawing a line, placing her firmly on the outside. You don't belong here. You are a servant. Less than. Thea's first instinct was to shrink, to become smaller, to let their words wash over her and retreat to the safety of Ian's room. But the ember of defiance that had glowed during her knife training flickered to life. She thought of Ian's trust, of the honey cake, of the quiet fort. She thought of Asher's murmured words. You have a quiet magic. She would not let them tarnish that. She lifted her chin, meeting Lyra's gaze directly. Her pale blue eyes, usually so full of sorrow, held a glint of frost. My place is where the alpha commands it, she said, her voice quiet but clear. And my duty is to Ian. The rest is of no concern to me. Lyra's smile was a razor's edge. Is that so? How very dedicated of you. She took another step closer, close enough for Thea to smell the subtle, musky perfume she wore. Let me be clear, Omega. Asher may have brought you here on a whim, charmed by his son's temporary fascination. But this pack has an order, a hierarchy. You would do well to remember your place in it, which is not at the alpha's side, and certainly not as a mother to his heir. The threat was undisguised. Thea's heart thudded, but she held her ground. She would not be cowed by this woman, not when she had just rediscovered what it felt like to have a sliver of ground to stand on. My place, Thea repeated, her voice gaining a sliver of steel, is with Ian. That is the only hierarchy that matters to me. She didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked away, her back straight, feeling their hostile stares burning into her. It was a small victory, but it was hers. She had not broken. The confrontation left her shaken, however. The lodge, which had begun to feel like a strange sort of sanctuary, now felt like a battlefield. She needed air, space away from the calculating eyes and whispered threats. She slipped out a side door into a small, walled garden tucked behind the lodge. It was a utilitarian space, with rows of hardy herbs and medicinal plants, but it was quiet and private. She sank onto a cold stone bench, pulling her knees to her chest, trying to slow her racing heart. The sound of heavy, confident footsteps made her look up. Asher stood at the garden's entrance, his large frame filling the archway. He had changed again, this time into his dark, open vest, his bare chest a testament to his primal power. His stormy eyes found her immediately, as if he had been looking for her. "Lyra," he stated, his voice a low growl. It wasn't a question. Thea looked away, focusing on a stubborn patch of lavender fighting its way through a crack in the stones. She just welcomed me to the pack. A grunt that was almost a laugh escaped him. He moved into the garden, the space shrinking with his presence. He didn't sit, but stood over her, a formidable shadow blocking the sun. She sees a threat. Lyra is not used to being threatened. "I am no threat to her," Thea said, the words tasting bitter. "I don't want what she wants." "What do you want, Thea?" The question, asked so bluntly, stunned her into silence. What did she want? A week ago, she had wanted the cold, final embrace of the gorge. Now she wanted the weight of a child's head in her lap. She wanted the taste of honey cake. She wanted to not feel the sharp edges of her grief with every breath. She wanted to feel the quiet magic he had seen in her. She couldn't say any of that. She just shook her head, a helpless gesture. Asher watched her, his gaze intense. "Ian is asking for you. He woke up and you were gone." Guilt, sharp and immediate, lanced through her. "I needed a moment. I know." He was silent for a beat. "The moon gathering is in 3 nights' time. The entire pack will be there." Thea's stomach dropped. Lyra's words echoed in her mind. "Hardly a place for a lower quarter Omega. I should stay with Ian." "Ian will be there," Asher said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And you will be with him." This was a command of a different kind. He wasn't just forcing her to be a nursemaid. He was forcing her into the heart of pack life, into the spotlight. It was the last thing she wanted. "Asher, please," she said, desperation creeping into her voice. She looked up at him, her pale eyes pleading. I don't belong at such a thing. People will stare. They'll talk." Lyra does not command this pack," he interrupted, his voice dropping into a low, possessive rumble that vibrated through the very stones beneath her feet. He took a final step, closing the distance between them. He loomed over her, not as a threat, but as a shield, a force of nature. "I do." He reached down, and for a heart-stopping moment, Thea thought he would touch her. Instead, his hand hovered near her face, then gently plucked a stray leaf from one of her white braids. The gesture was shockingly intimate. "They will stare," he agreed, his stormy eyes holding hers captive. "Let them. They will see the woman my son has chosen. They will see the woman who stood before a boar with nothing but a stick." His gaze was fierce, protective, and utterly terrifying. "They will see that you are under my protection." The words were a crown she had never wanted, a declaration that bound her to him in the eyes of the entire pack. It was not a declaration of love, it was something more primal. A claim. Before she could process it, before she could form a single, coherent thought, he turned and strode from the garden, leaving her alone on the bench, the ghost of his near touch burning on her skin, the weight of his protection feeling heavier than any chain. She was caught. The fragile peace she'd found with Ian was now entangled with the brutal politics of the pack and the fierce, unwelcome regard of its king. The moon gathering loomed before her. Not a celebration, but a trial. And she was to walk into it, a pale, scarred Omega, wearing the unwanted crown of the Alpha's attention. The next 2 days passed in a strange, suspended rhythm. Thea's world had shrunk to the lodge's stone corridors, the kitchen's warmth, and the sacred space of Ian's blanket fort. Her knife-fighting lessons with Kale continued, a daily dose of humiliation and burgeoning strength. Her muscles ached, but the ache was a familiar, almost comforting reminder that she was still alive, still capable of change. Asher was a constant, brooding presence, a storm cloud on the periphery of her new life. He was often gone, dealing with pack business, but his return was always a seismic event that Thea felt before she saw him. Ian would perk up, a sixth sense alerting him to his father's presence, and Thea's own senses would sharpen, her body tensing in a mixture of dread and a strange, unwelcome anticipation. He watched her. She knew he did. During meals, his stormy gaze would drift to her, lingering on her hands as she helped Ian with his cup. On the way, she tucked a stray white strand of hair behind her ear. He never spoke to her directly in front of others unless it was a command about Ian, but the silence between them was a live wire, humming with unspoken questions. The morning of the moon gathering dawned crisp and clear. A nervous energy thrummed through the lodge. Thea could feel it in the hurried steps of the servants, in the way even Marta's usual calm seemed frayed at the edges. Dread was a cold stone in Thea's stomach. She had managed to avoid Lyra since their confrontation in the garden, but tonight, there would be no escape. As she was helping Ian into a clean tunic, a young, timid maid she didn't recognize appeared at the door, clutching a bundle of dark fabric. "For you, miss," the girl mumbled, not meeting Thea's eyes. "From the Alpha. For the gathering." Thea's heart gave a complicated lurch. She took the bundle. It was soft, heavier than it looked. When she shook it out, she caught her breath. It was a dress. But unlike the simple gray wool she was used to, this was a deep forest green, the color of moss and shadows. The fabric was a soft, brushed velvet, and it was embroidered at the cuffs and high neckline with silver thread in a pattern of swirling vines and howling wolves. It was the most beautiful garment she had ever touched. It was also unmistakably the clothing of a high-ranking pack female, not a servant. "He sent this?" Thea asked, her voice faint. The maid nodded nervously and scurried away. Ian tugged on the velvet. "Pretty. Like your eyes, but darker." Thea's hands trembled. This was not protection. This was a declaration. By dressing her in this, Asher was making a statement to the entire pack, throwing her into the heart of the den without a weapon. It felt less like a gift and more like a weapon in his hand, one he was using to parry Lyra's ambitions. That evening, dressed in the green velvet, Thea felt like an imposter. The dress fit her slender frame perfectly, hugging her curves before falling in soft folds to the floor. It made her skin look like porcelain, her white braids a startling, dramatic contrast against the rich color. She looked noble. She looked like she belonged, and the dissonance was terrifying. She held Ian's hand as they walked towards the roaring sounds of the gathering, the great bonfire, a flickering beacon in the center of the main square. The entire pack seemed to be there, hundreds of them, their faces illuminated by the firelight. The air was thick with the smells of roasting meat, spiced ale, and wild, unchecked energy. As they entered the circle of light, a hush fell. It was just like the training grounds, but 1,000 times worse. Every face turned towards them. She saw the shock, the curiosity, the open hostility. And then she saw Lyra. The huntress was stunning, dressed in a gown of supple, smoke-gray leather that left one shoulder bare, showcasing a tattoo of a coiled serpent. Her dark hair was braided with feathers and silver beads. She stood near the high table where Asher sat, her expression a mask of cool amusement that didn't reach her venomous eyes. Asher rose from his carved chair. He was a figure of primal power, dressed in black, a heavy fur mantle draped over his shoulders. His stormy gaze swept the crowd and landed on Thea and Ian. He didn't smile, but he gestured for them to come forward. Ian, oblivious to the tension, pulled Thea towards the high table. The crowd parted for them, a silent, staring sea. Thea's legs felt like water. She was a mouse being paraded before a congress of wolves. As they reached the table, Asher's eyes did a slow, deliberate sweep of her, from her intricate braids to the green velvet dress. A flicker of something hot and possessive ignited in their gray depths, so fast she thought she might have imagined it. "You look acceptable," he said, his voice low. It was the barest shred of praise, but from him, it felt like a caress. Thea felt a treacherous warmth spread through her chest. The feast began. Thea sat beside Ian, picking at the food on her plate, her appetite gone. She was hyper-aware of Asher on Ian's other side, of his large, powerful form, of the way he occasionally leaned down to listen to something his son whispered. She was also acutely aware of Lyra's gaze, a constant, drilling pressure from a few seats away. As the ale flowed, the pack grew louder, more boisterous. A space was cleared before the bonfire for dancing and displays of strength. Young warriors began to compete in feats of agility and power, vying for the attention of the unmated females. Thea watched, mesmerized and alienated by the raw, joyful savagery of it all. It was during a lull that Lyra made her move. She rose, a cup of wine in her hand, and glided towards the high table. Her smile was a razor blade. "Alpha," she said, her voice carrying over the din. "The pack thrives under your strength. A toast to your health." She drank, her eyes never leaving his. Then she turned her predatory smile on Thea. "And to our guest. It is so rare to have someone from the lower quarter join us at the high table. Tell me, Thea, do they have celebrations like this where you're from? Or is life there too, grim for such frivolity?" The question was perfectly designed to humiliate. A few snickers rippled through the crowd nearest to them. Thea felt her face flame. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Before she could form a response, Asher spoke, his voice cutting through the noise like a whip. "Thea's past is of no concern to this pack," he said, his tone flat and final. "Her worth is not measured by the dirt of the lower quarter, but by the courage she showed in saving my son's life. That is a worth few in this pack can claim." The silence that followed was absolute. Lyra's smile froze, then melted away, leaving a stark, ugly rage in its place. Asher had publicly rebuked her. He had championed Thea. He turned his head, his stormy gaze locking with Thea's. In the flickering firelight, his face was all sharp angles and shadowed planes, a mask of absolute authority. But in his eyes, she saw it again, that fierce, protective possessiveness. It should have frightened her. Instead, a reckless, wild feeling surged in her chest, a feeling that had been buried for years. Defiance. Lyra, seething, gave a stiff nod. "Of course, Alpha. Forgive my curiosity." She shot Thea a look that promised retribution, before turning on her heel and stalking away. The feast resumed, but the atmosphere had shifted. Thea no longer felt like a mouse. She felt like a pawn who had just been moved into a position of unexpected power by a king who was an enigma. She sat a little straighter, the green velvet dress feeling less like a costume and more like armor. Later, as the moon rose high, Ian fell asleep against her side, lulled by the fire and the full belly. Thea gently shifted him, preparing to carry him back to the lodge. "I'll take him." Asher was there, his voice a quiet rumble beside her. He didn't wait for her assent, simply leaning down and gathering his son into his arms with an effortless, tender strength that made Thea's throat tighten. Ian sighed in his sleep, nestling his head against his father's shoulder. Asher stood for a moment, the sleeping child in his arms, his eyes on Thea. The bonfire cast his face in golden shadow. "You held your ground," he said. It wasn't praise. It was another observation, an acknowledgement. Then he turned and carried his son towards the lodge, leaving Thea standing by the dying fire, the scent of smoke and his presence clinging to her green velvet dress. The sting of Lyra's serpent tongue was gone, replaced by the bewildering, terrifying warmth of the Alpha's regard. The territory of her grief was still vast, but under the light of the full moon, with the echo of his defense ringing in her ears, it felt, for the first time, like a territory she might not have to inhabit alone.